Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Ramin Setoodeh, co-editor-in-chief of Variety and author of Apprentice and Wonderland. Ramin, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to you today.
Many books have covered the Trump's presidency, but you took a really interesting angle where you went to what you describe as his origin story, which is when he was host and one of the executive producers of The Apprentice. And as we all know, let's take a walk down memory lane. Over 20 years ago, Trump was known as a New York real estate mogul, but The Apprentice really shot him to national and international stardom. And in your few sit-down meetings with Trump, he would often pose the question, so do you think I would be president if it wasn't for The Apprentice? So let's start there. What's the answer?
So Trump didn't admit to me that the answer to that question is no, but a lot of people in his orbit, including Mark Burnett, and even a conversation I had with his son Eric, indicated that if it wasn't for The Apprentice, Donald Trump would not have been president of the United States. He would not be running as the Republican nominee this year to be president of the United States. This show unlocked the secret of Donald Trump. It created him and made him into a huge star. It is the reason why we're all constantly talking about Donald Trump. It's the reason why politically we're at the place that we're at right now. This is the most consequential show in the history of television. It changed the world. And my book goes through and looks at what exactly The Apprentice did to Trump's image and the way it programmed millions of Americans to really like him and respect him and root for him and think he was a great business leader.
Something that really stuck out to me in your book was just how accessible Donald Trump was those 20 years ago, because when the contestants got famously fired in the boardroom, they would go back to the hotel, but they had to stay there. And Trump would often visit those sequestered failed contestants. He would answer the phone to the press. He would be able to fill in a slot if a talk show host was not available. So can you talk about his accessibility back then and how it translated to his presidency now?
Trump's number one obsession, the thing that drives him, the thing that motivates him, the thing that inspires him, is attention. Performing for the cameras, getting press. It doesn't matter if it's a good headline or a bad headline. Trump believes that all press is good press. And so as the host of The Apprentice, he was so happy and so enamored by all this attention that he got that he started to think that the show was real life for him. And he would develop all these bonds and relationships with the contestants and use the contestants as spokespeople for his brand. They would talk about the Trump organization. The Apprentice winners would go off and talk about how great it was working with Donald Trump. And even though their job was to be running one of Trump's businesses, their real job was actually promoting Donald Trump in the press. And so we used every element of the show, every aspect of The Apprentice, as publicity for him to feed his business. And also he ended up making a significant amount of money from the show, $213 million over hosting for 14 seasons.
You watched The Apprentice, obviously rewatched it. You even rewatched many supercuts with Donald Trump. I mean, he famously coined the phrase, "You're fired." What are the biggest parallels that you saw rewatching The Apprentice from 20 years ago that you saw really translate into his presidency?
Well, certainly I think the most obvious way that he used The Apprentice was by hiring Omarosa, who was often a villain on the show, came back for 3 seasons, and then he brought her in as an aide in his White House and then ended up firing her there too. But when Donald Trump and I were sitting together watching scenes from The Apprentice, I noticed that he was very, very happy. He was pleased. He was excited. I think I describe in the book that it was like him watching the opening credits was like him, a child watching Star Wars again for the first time. There was a real magic and a sense of this is what he wanted to do with his life. And he loves the show. The reason he gave me so many interviews is that he really loved talking about the show. We started talking together in 2021 for this book and continued on through 2023. So we spent a lot of time talking over many years about what the show meant to him. And clearly it's a very important part of what he thinks his legacy is.
I think that's really interesting because there was a juxtaposition when he was talking with you about The Apprentice versus when he was talking with you about being the president. You would think if someone's the president, the leader of the free world, that would be their shining joy, the thing that they would always go back to, the thing that they would always talk about, be proud of it. He was way more proud, it seemed, of The Apprentice. I mean, the way you described it, I think at one point was maybe a high school football player reliving the glory days from back in the day, and he was very happy. I think he asked you to send him the link that you found on YouTube of a supercut of him firing people and some of the best moments in the boardroom. Yeah. And then when he would talk about his presidency, it was defensive and holding grudges and having an enemy list. So can you talk about that juxtaposition?
For Trump, the reason he loved The Apprentice was that he played the boss of the boardroom and he had ultimate control over everything that was happening. But when he took this reality TV mirage and moved it to the White House, he completely lost control. Trump isn't actually interested in governing. He's not interested in sort of the semantics of what's happening in DC or legislation. He's not interested in actually leading the country. One of the arguments in my book is that Donald Trump is a reality star, and we all have gone down the rabbit hole with him. The title of the book is Apprentice in Wonderland, because there's a very Alice in Wonderland quality where we're all now living in this alternate reality where a reality star is trying to govern us. And in my time with him, it became very clear to me that he loved being host of The Apprentice, and as for being president, that wasn't as exciting for him.
I think another argument in your book is trying to put Donald Trump in a box. And I want to read a quote, and then we can talk about it a little more. Quote, Trump presented a conundrum for a reporter. He might have been the sower of chaos all over the globe, and he certainly lacked empathy, but he could also be funny and engaging in conversation. And you talked about him once calling you and saying he was proud of you, and it was almost this father-like moment. Yeah. You had the ability to talk with Trump for over 20 years, and you sat down with him and spoke and had, I believe, 6 interviews with him for this book. So talk to us about what he's like in person, maybe something that the average American who only turns on the news, sees him in press conferences, wouldn't get a full picture of.
He is the character that he is on screen, the person he plays on screen. He is the same character in real life. But in real life, he is incredibly charismatic. He can be kind, he can be funny, he can be charming. He has a very Bill Clinton quality to him where when you're in the room, he's very engaged, and you kind of do sort of forget that he's created all these problems and is the center of all these lawsuits and allegations, and you do want his approval. Contestants I talked to talked about that. When he's in the room, he has this quality where you do want his approval, you want him to be engaged, you want him to like you, and he is very likable in person. In the time we talked together, he's very entertaining, he's gossipy, he's very fixated on Hollywood and celebrities. But again, these are all qualities that make him a great reality star and do not make him qualified to be president of the United States.
Did you like him when you were talking with him?
Sure. When I talked to him and he was telling me funny stories about, being on the boardroom with Dennis Rodman or firing Omarosa or talking about, the different feuds that the contestants were part of, it was very entertaining. He has this story about performing at the Emmys over 20 years ago that he remembers very vividly, more vividly than any bills that he passed in Congress or things he got done as president. And it's certainly entertaining talking to him in the same way that it's entertaining talking to most reality stars. But again, it goes back to the question of politically, what are his qualifications to be in the Oval Office?
I want to talk about the Emmy performance, or the performance where he was dressed as a farmer. He was with that actress, and he was talking with you, and he couldn't remember exactly, did she do anything bad to me? Did she wrong me? Should I be holding a grudge? He remembers the Deborah Messing grudge quite well. But I want to talk about his relationship with women, because it seems like he puts them into a few boxes. One is objectifying them. They're beautiful, and then they burn me, and then I'm done with them, and that's it. He did that with Jennifer Murphy at one point. He did that with Deborah Messing, amongst others. But then Carolyn Kepcher, who was the Kellyanne Conway of the time, really, she was a judge on The Apprentice. She was very high up at the Trump organization. She never said anything bad about him. He never said anything bad about her to you. He did fire her years ago, but didn't speak ill of her, and seem to really respect her. So can you talk about the juxtaposition in the way he treats women?
He views women as objects. We know that. And so often he would talk about women in terms of their physical appearances. Very famously so, he and I had a conversation about Taylor Swift, which now has been picked up, where he called her beautiful in a string of sentences, and it was objectifying her and creepy, and a lot of Taylor Swift fans didn't like that. But he does view women as objects of beauty. He rates their appearances. He talks about whether or not he thought Deborah Messing was beautiful, and as a result of her beauty, he was very hurt when she betrayed him by criticizing him on social media and being very vicious to him on social media. And so he does have a problematic relationship with women. But in this book, you really do see how that began on The Apprentice, and you do see a very inappropriate relationship that began with one of the contestants in season 4. Her name is Jennifer Murphy, and I do really chronicle what was happening between the two of them, and Trump giving her favorable treatment because he found her very attractive as a former beauty pageant winner.
I want to talk about the arc from when you met with Trump. So you met with him first a few months after January 6th in 2021, and you described Trump Tower almost like a department store past its prime. Donald Trump almost seemed like a shell of himself. He wasn't sure if he was going to run. And then 2 years later, in late 2023, was your last visit with him, and you described him as almost phoenix-like. He's rising from the ashes, and this is when he's embroiled in legal challenges. At this point, he was in the civil fraud trial in New York. So can you talk about that arc and what made him go from, rise from those ashes?
That was a very interesting transformation that I saw in the 3 years I talked to him, because after the election, he wasn't on Twitter. He wasn't getting attention. He wasn't in the press anymore. And he was very deflated. He was very resentful. He had a lot of regrets about not staying in the Oval Office, made a lot of allegations that weren't true about voter fraud, but really missed the spotlight. I could see that he feeds off the spotlight. And then when I visited him again, we talked throughout that summer, and then I visited him again in 2023 at Mar-a-Lago. There were a lot of legal issues. There was a civil fraud trial, and there were a lot of allegations that were coming against him legally. And I thought that maybe he'd be even more deflated. But he was actually energized because he thrives on conflict. He thrives on being in the media. He thrives on being, quote, this underdog. And these legal cases that were brought against him actually gave him an opponent to rail against. And he was much more energized in 2023 when I talked to him than when we talked at the beginning of this book. And he likes the attention. It doesn't matter if it's good attention or bad attention. As long as he's at the center of the attention, he really sees a path for himself to thrive. And he's been able to do that for the last 8 years.
I want to talk about another character in the book, and that's Mark Burnett, as we know from Survivor fame and also Apprentice fame. And he was on top of the world about 20 years ago, and it also goes through this 20-year arc, so to speak. He's been blamed for the Trump presidency. And when you talked with him, I mean, it was also, it seemed like at one point, a shell of a person. He was begging you to get into parties at Sundance. Can you talk about his transformation and who is Mark Burnett today in American society?
So Mark Burnett is the reason that Donald Trump is president of the United States. He created the image of Trump on The Apprentice. He also created Survivor. He's a very successful reality TV producer. But as Trump became more and more powerful and more people were blaming Mark Burnett for Trump's rise, even though he continued to remain very close to Donald Trump, he publicly withdrew from the public because he's not seen as a public person. He'd rather, I think, create a reality show than be part of a reality show. And so this book really explores his contributions to Trump, his creation of Trump, and the way in which he was behind the scenes editing footage of The Apprentice, because those boardroom scenes that we watch at home, sometimes they would go on for 4 hours. And George Ross, who's one of the boardroom advisors, said that things were moved around, people would smile when they weren't smiling, they could really create any story they wanted. And Mark Burnett was this Bengali that created Donald Trump, and this book really shines a light on how exactly he made us believe that Donald Trump was a good boss and a good person in the boardroom.
You've been covering The Apprentice for 20 years. You mentioned in the book at one point you even faked an audition to get in there and get the inside scoop. Covering Trump for 20 years, watching The Apprentice, and now really having the inside scoop of The Apprentice really being Donald Trump's origin story, what surprises you the most?
Right. When I was in my 20s, one of my first jobs at Newsweek, I actually auditioned for a season of The Apprentice just to see what they were doing. And I was so surprised because when I went to the audition, Donald Trump showed up and he wanted to see all the contestants and he was feeding off the crowds. It was really, truly a precursor to Trump being at a political rally where he was at a rally of Apprentice fans. And for me, covering the show, looking at the show, I still think it's a very entertaining show. It's a good reality show. But what I've learned in the show and what it's contributed to society is that this is the key. And a lot of political reporters, and I think a lot of people in the media that cover him now, aren't aware of just how important this show is in creating the image of Donald Trump. And they think he went from real estate to politics, but it's actually he went from reality TV to politics. And this book shows you exactly how he uses the media to get the attention he wants and to get the poll numbers he wants. And that's why he's continuing forward, even though there should logically have been a point where this should have stopped.
What point do you think that should have stopped, that, it just kept going and this was that launching pad for the Donald Trump that we all know today?
I mean, I think most of us thought this was over after the insurrection. And when Trump left the White House against his own will, It did seem like the era of Donald Trump in American politics should have been over. But like any reality star, there's always this idea of a comeback. And so he, again, uses the tricks that he learned in Hollywood and from being on a reality show to continue going. And right now, the rest of the country is really held captive to the Trump narrative still, all these years later.
Right now, as we all know, he is running for president once again, and mental acuity has been a concern for both candidates, more so President Biden, but Donald Trump has made his own gaffes on the campaign trail. He's mixed up leaders, both internationally and domestically. Did you get a sense that Donald Trump's mental acuity now isn't the same as it was 2 years ago when you met him, even 20 years ago when you first started covering him?
What was interesting about his memory is that he remembered things that happened 20 years ago, but his short-term memory wasn't as strong or as sharp. And what was really jarring to me was between our first and second interview. The first interview happened in May of 2021. The second interview happened in August of 2021. And he introduced himself to me as if we'd never spoken. And I asked him, I said, "Do you remember me?" And he said, "No, it was a long time ago that we spoke." So we had a great first meeting. He was very engaged and interested. We had a long conversation in his office, and the fact that he didn't remember any of that just a few months later did seem concerning to me and say something about his short-term memory abilities.
By the end, he was offering to sell your book at rallies if it painted him in a favorable light. And you really do show this 3D version of Donald Trump as this chaos agent, as someone who's very loose with facts, whether they be big or small, whether they be about TV ratings, literally right in front of your face. But you also show someone who's extremely charismatic, extremely engaging, very funny. What does Donald Trump think about your book?
I do not think that he's going to be selling this book at his rallies anymore. But I really did want to give everyone a front row seat to what Donald Trump is like and who he is. And I think this book accomplishes a portrait of Donald Trump that we haven't seen before. So if you like him or if you don't like him and really want to know what he's really like and what drives him, this book is for you.
Ramin, it was a great book. I devoured it in a matter of days. Where can people find it?
You can find this book at all bookstores. It's available on Amazon and at Barnes & Noble.
Ramin, thank you so much for joining me. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you so much for a great conversation.